Hi, welcome to In Search of. For this first episode, I'm very excited to share a conversation with Candace Thompson of the C.U.R.B, or the Collaborative Urban Resilience Banquet. It's a multifaceted multimedia project aimed at engaging New Yorkers and city dwellers more broadly with their plant neighbors and their non-human neighbors. It's part of her own effort of learning and developing skills around foraging and plant identification and the history of how certain plants came to become endemic in city environments. It also takes the form of actual banquets that Candace hosts, where people from the community gather around meals made from foraged and native plants and pigeon eggs and things like that. It's a very interesting and colorful project, and I encourage everyone to look into it. Candace is also the manager of Skycoa Park in the Lower East Side. It's one of only 2 parks in New York City that not only permits foraging, but actually encourages it. Unfortunately, Stycov Park is scheduled to be demolished in about a year to make way for a seawall in preparation of rising seawaters. As sad as that is, it does set the tone and context for our conversation, which also happened on the day that the IPCC released its latest report on the state of the climate, which was not optimistic or encouraging. So you will probably hear that reflected in our conversation, but it informs what we're talking about and underscores, I think, the relevance of reconsideration of our place in nature and the reality that nature is with us wherever we go. So I am excited to share this conversation with you, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Well, thank you, Candace, for being here. It's great to talk to you again. It's been a
Nice to
minute.
see you. Yeah,
Are you
it's been a
at?
whole.
I know a whole pandemic has passed. Hopefully, it's the only one we'll have to mark. Um, are you at Stycov right now?
I am. I'm in the shipping office container that I work out of. I'll show you. The park is just out here. It's just that it's sandwiched between the FDR and the East River, so it's kind of loud. So I feel like while not as scenic, the soundscape might be a little better indoors. But yes, I am at Skycoa Park right now.
So, are you managing Stycov Park now? Is that your role there?
Yeah, I am the park manager of Skycoa Park. And if you want me to give like a little spiel about what it is.
Sure. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm leading to.
Yeah, so it is oh boy. Okay, I'm gonna start here. It's not real land. If you were to look at footage of, if you were to look at the Mannahatta project, you would see that this little cove used to be much covier. And like most of the New York City coastline, it was built out of landfill and trash and, soil that was excavated when they built. Then it was a coal and gas storage place and a shipping yard. And then it was a concrete manufacturing facility, I believe. And then it was just like a no man's land, just east of Stuytown, Peter Cooper Village. And in the late 90s, some developers wanted to put in a river walk with shops and all this stuff. And the people of Stuytown fought, particularly a group of women who are now elders, some of whom I have the privilege of knowing, fought for it to become a green space instead. And so it did in the early 2000s. It is a park that is not managed by New York City Parks. It's managed by the nonprofit that I work for, Solar One. And the park is now about 20 years old. We've got nice big mature oak and native elm trees. And it is built on top of a capped brown field. So, those coal and gas storage legacies are still under there, underneath a layer of concrete, on top of which there is about a 3-foot deep, giant raised bed, ostensibly of clean soil. And over the 20 years that it has existed, the mission of the park has shifted from being kind of a passive use park. So you walk on the path, you look at the plants are behind a fence, don't touch, just admire, to an active use park. So the people who managed it prior to me kind of really wanted to start to break down that barrier between park goer and non-human park residents, right? And so we now refer to it as a food forest. And we, unlike most New York City parks, with the exception of Concrete Plant Park, allow and encourage people to forage. responsibly. And during my tenure here, I have been doing a lot of wild food events, which is an extension of the work I was doing prior, where I stuff from the park and host little parties where I serve it to everybody and kind of talk about our relationship to our implicit relationship within nature, is what I should say. It is a park that is actually on hospice at this point because of climate change. So at the end of this month, the north end of the park gets raised for the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, which is part of a project building a giant flood wall around the bottom of Manhattan. So yeah, it's a very potent moment in this park's existence. And I've been trying to figure out how to make the most meaning out of it as possible.
You touched on a lot of stuff there that I wanted to get into anyway. So I'll just kind of work down as I was taking notes while you were talking. Well, first of all, you've been doing this for how long, as far as the Stycov solar one is concerned?
Yeah, so I technically started working at Stycov the week before New York City locked down last March.
Right.
And at the time, I was going to just be the wild food educator for the summer. My friend Emily Curtis Murphy was the previous park manager. The pandemic hit. She's a single mom of 2 kids. New York City was not a good look for a single mom of 2 kids during the pandemic. So she bounced, and I became the park manager last July. So it's been about a year. Yeah, it's been about a year and some change that I've been working here.
Okay. And you mentioned that this is one of the only, maybe the only place in the city that encourages foraging, and
there are 2.
Oh, there are 2. Okay.
There are 2. Yeah. So the other one, which I am a huge champion of, is the Foodway, the Bronx River Foodway at Concrete Plant Park, which is wonderful. I was just there on Saturday. And it is actually a pilot project by New York City Parks, whereas we are functioning outside of the park system. So we have a different set of litigious relationships, I guess I could say, or bureaucratic relationships.
Right. Or entanglements.
The entanglements, there you go.
Well, yeah, so that's exactly what I'm curious about, because from what I understand, there are some legal barriers to foraging. There are, I mean, if not legal, then policy, or just sort of by rote, at least. And I guess it's unique to New York City, or New York City has its own kind of unique posture towards foraging. And we've talked about this before, but yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, how is that allowed in the first place? Like, how does that operate in the midst of the regulatory environment around foraging? And can you describe that environment a bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is where like lawyers would probably cringe a little bit. So I hope I don't get myself in trouble. But the fact is, people forage in every city park. The only difference here is that when I see people doing it, I'm not going to give them a ticket. I'm not a park cop in any way, shape, or form. And when I have people come through, I am very explicit, like, look, you're doing this at your own risk, like you need to know what you're doing. And, I have some amount of research and understanding of toxicity and its implications on, potentially foraging out of this site or any site in urban cities. And I'm just very clear with people, like, look, the food you get from the grocery store is potentially contaminated too. You're eating this once. If you are pregnant, if you are a small child, this is probably not a meal for you. But I try to kind of lay out all of the complexities in choosing to eat anything, really, and try and give people agency to make their own choices, which is something that our legal system is not meant to do. It's meant to absolve people in power from being held accountable for their actions. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm explaining that as well as I want. Yeah, it's complicated,
I mean, it's just an instant illustration of how much this stuff connects to bigger issues. We're talking about picking some, mint or something from while you're in the city, and we're automatically talking. I mean, one of the things that came up in our previous conversation about this was how much racism plays a role in the policy toward foraging. And I guess, yeah, do the kinds of communities that end up showing up to Stycov to forage kind of reflect maybe traditions that are not so welcome in the city?
Yes, absolutely. I see older Asian American folks all the time, collecting dandelions and field garlics, and I've got Latine and seemingly indigenous. I don't walk around asking people for ethnic background. Harvesting the poke and the mugwort and the lamb's quarter. And I, as much as I'm excited for them to be doing it, I always like want to walk up and be like, "Hi, I want to know how you use this." Like I try and just kind of like give people their space and let them do what they do. And then through the volunteer events and the wild food events that we do kind of actively, we're allowing people who are interested in these things but don't have become disassociated from that sort of ancestral knowledge. We're trying to kind of give them a little bit of help reconnect that relationship for them as well. So I mean, if you know what you're doing, just come do what you would do in any normal city park. If you are wanting to learn, then you should come hang out with us and we can, teach you who the Juneberries are.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, all of that legality is based in, post-slavery, anti-Black and anti-immigration law.
Right.
I'm not here for that.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking. And you mentioned the types of foods that various communities might forage based on their traditions, and it as you mentioned that, it reminded me to note that from what I understand, what grows at Stycov is all native to the region. Is that right?
I mean, that's the aspiration. By and large, there are plenty of plants who are not from here, and I have far fuzzier of a binary between who should and shouldn't be here in that regard. It was set up as a native plant park, and the majority of the plants are natives. However, many of the wonderful spontaneous urban plants who show up here are some of our best food and medicine. It's also been really interesting. I was just having a conversation with one of my favorite ongoing volunteers on Friday. There are also plants that are from here that people see as weeds: pokeweed, evening primrose, Virginia peppergrass, right? These plants that you see growing out of every sidewalk. Well, I'm working in a park that's about to be bulldozed. We are facing inevitable climate crisis. Why would I spend my time pulling up plants that survive just fine without me having to water them every day, that feed birds, that make pollinators happy? I've been really kind of asking myself a lot of questions recently about who am I gardening for and why, And so I am far less interested at this moment in this journey I'm on of making something that looks like a perfect park, and more interested in having conversations about, yeah, it's evening primrose, it's native, yeah, it's abundant, it's also really important for nighttime pollinators. Why should I pull it up? Mm-hmm. Please tell me. Yeah, pokeweed, it's huge. Yeah, it feeds all the migratory birds in the fall. I'm gonna have a dyeing workshop with it. I don't have to water it. Why do I need to kill it? And so I think it's just really interesting the way we kind of put these human, largely aesthetic values and anything that's abundant, mm-hmm. we deem as worthless, mm-hmm. which is really a whack way to look at the world.
And that's a good way to put it. But it occurs to me, I mean, and I want to get into the impending demolition of this space and the reasons for that. That's sort of the big picture context for everything we're talking about, I guess. But you just in that thread of thought, it struck me that there is a sort of parallel with the way that we view immigrants, or that our society writ large does when it comes to plants, as it does with people. Maybe there's some echoes of the mentality there. You feel like there's something to that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And just a need for control, a desire to, I've been doing a lot of reading about, we did a workshop on queer ecology in June, and I was doing some reading about the High Line and the development of the High Line. It was a really awesome research paper somebody had written. I'll have to find it so you can put it in your show notes. But about how here was a space that was an abandoned, railroad track that was covered in all kinds of spontaneous urban plants, was its own viable ecosystem, serving some sort of purpose for birds and pollinators. And it was a marginal space for, the queer community. And then all of a sudden it becomes, in the move from wanting to preserve it, it becomes this like uber gentrified space, right? And like the ways in which kind of like green gentrification can also be a thing, and so I don't know. I think as of recent, I've been thinking that if I'm a landscape designer, I landscape design with weeds, because they're here and they're doing fine. And like, why am I going to waste a bunch of water and resources to keep a bunch of plants alive that don't want to be here? It's not to say that I'm not taking care of my spice bushes and my asters and my goldenrods, and my trees and things, but I'm also not going to be like, oh God, so much pokeweed, it's got to go. I don't know. I'm having a very blurry moment with regards to how I steward this land.
Yeah, which I guess seems appropriate given that you're dealing with living things and ecologies, which are not as well defined and sharply divided as our gardens might suggest, or our public green spaces might lead us to start to conceive of nature as these like simple systems almost, that have that, like you said, are dictated in their form largely by our aesthetics and not necessarily by the roles or potential that they represent. And I guess that's not something that one should expect to have a clear grasp of, and that's sort of the point, right? Like the practice you're describing is one of letting go of control, and I can't imagine that would feel anything but a little bit fuzzy. That's sort of the point, right?
And also thinking of it as a space that, when I do pull something out, it's because I want to use it. Like right now the bindweed is going bananas, and there are some beds in this park that I just have, it has won. It can have it. But right now, like got these long runners that run along the ground, and I could pull like 8 feet of those things out at once. Where's the weaver? Where is the basket maker? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to make baskets. I don't have time to make baskets, but like I have a resource, right? Like I'm letting the coat grow so that we can have a dyeing workshop. When I let the lamb's quarter grow, it's so that I can make curry for everybody on the solstice. Like to an outside eye, I think sometimes it would look like chaos, but I'm also harvesting from this space for the community's purpose. You know what I mean? And which is what, land-based people, indigenous, peasant, etc., have done for centuries. There's no such thing as wilderness. There's only humans actively stewarding space or not actively stewarding space. And so it is a little more chaotic, but there are intentions behind it. It just doesn't look necessarily aesthetically like what most other people would expect.
Yeah. And it occurs to me while you were saying that plant blindness might be a bit of a factor here, because to see someone like tending what someone automatically perceives as a weed or a pest or something, or an invasive, totally changes the picture of what you're doing in that space. To suddenly recognize lamb's quarter for what it is and for the uses it has, and its place in the ecological, firmament, then. Which I'm realizing might be a misleading way to put it, because firmament suggests it's fixed, but it's not. It's a dialogue, right, in the process more than a set system. But simply recognizing, and again, there are parallels socially here. It seems to me like recognizing our neighbors and their value, and recognizing that value as outside of our own preferences or our own individual needs, but as sovereign and self, with its own dignity inherent to it. We could talk about people and plants the same way. It's occurring to me. But I did want to just make sure to touch on something a huge issue that we're kind of dancing right past here, which is the climate change piece and the fact that this place we're talking about, where you're fostering these plants, these practices and thoughts around them, is about to be demolished. I guess, I mean, I could give my own sense of what's going on there, but can you tell me about that? Like, what's going on? Is it gone after that, or?
No. So, there are folks who have been here in this park for 20 years who tell me every day at high tide, the water crests the esplanade. So, depending on where you're sitting, you're going to get a wonderful CSO Gallagher show of East River water on you while you're sitting on a bench trying to enjoy the view of Long Island City. Elders tell me that 20 years ago that did not happen. Now it is a twice a day occurrence. So it is not theoretical, it is here. And obviously everyone who lived here during Sandy, I mean, we're right above the Con Ed plant, which if you lived here during Sandy, you watched the video footage like I did of it exploding because it flooded, right? So like, this is not like a hypothetical future. This is our past and our present. There is a lot that could be said about how this whole plan has been put in place and the communities that have not been listened to in the decisions that were made. There's a lot that could be said about that. I am, on work time right now, so I'm not going to say much. All I can say is it is happening. And, I do not live in this neighborhood. So I ultimately don't have a dog in this fight. I am a gardener. I will garden until someone tells me to stop. I have been trying to make the most of this time, but I have, for both like job-based reasons and just personal reasons, felt like it was not my job to fight the construction. It was to make use of this time as best as possible. Yeah, and so there will be a new park that comes back after the construction is over. The construction is going to take a couple of years. It's happening in parts. That park is already, the landscape design has been planned. It will not be a space that is expressly designed for edibles. And I know that that was something that we asked for, and it was not taken into consideration, it would seem. I have a bunch of feelings about that. The one that is coming up to me recently is that, like, the IPCC came out today. They're starting to say that coastlines are going to have 100-year floods every year. There are 4 CSO outlets along this coast. Yeah, if it's going to flood like Sandy every year on this side of this flood wall, no, we probably shouldn't from this land, actually. That's real. So, I think that nature is going to, the climate crisis is going to dictate how this space gets used in the future. As long as I work here, I will try and figure out some way to help people connect to ecology through the food web. But what that's going to look like after this demolition, I'm not certain right now. I don't know if there will be raised beds. It's been very unclear what the design is going to look like. It's all very unclear. They're not great communicators. So, I'm just kind of I'm on a ride, and I'm not really sure where it's going to stop and let me off at the moment.
Yeah, well, I guess that could apply to everybody on planet Earth at the moment in one sense or another. And I guess just to make clear, because I'm not sure if I mentioned it or if you did, but the demolition is to make way for a seawall, which is meant to stop or defer some of this flooding that you're talking about.
Yeah, we'll see about that. A wetland out into the East River would have probably worked a lot better, but that's not what they did. They wanted to do a bunch of new construction, which, when you're facing carbon dioxide fueled climate crisis, doesn't necessarily seem like the thing to do. Demolish a carbon sink and do a bunch of new construction. But hey, I'm not in power.
Yeah, we keep coming up against that problem, right? We're not in power. Part of the work that you're doing that I admire so much is that, like, in the midst of that context and this disastrous sort of status quo, you're just doing the alternative. You're enacting the alternative, it seems to me, and whatever impact it might have, like in gross amounts of carbon sequestered, or like number of people connected to their foodways or their native neighbor plants, things like that. It's more like what it represents, I think, than any like deliverable. That's what matters most, precisely because we're not in power and we can't expect to like implement these practices and philosophies at scale, right? We can only kind of represent them.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I was on a talk I was in a thing a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about how I've been growing a Three Sisters garden in the north part of the park that's about to be demolished, and I've got like 3 weeks left, and I'm hoping everything comes ripe in time. Um, I'm not producing food at scale. I'm telling stories with food. I'm telling stories with plants, and so I built a Three Sisters garden because I wanted to show what kind of park we could have once this is over. And by having the goats here last fall, like talking about the ways that we could be managing land that aren't herbicides, right? That aren't just pulling up a bunch of weeds and throwing them in the trash, which happens more than it should, right? These ways that it's like, I have to make sure that the gestures I'm doing kind of are in line with what should be how we operate. You know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, I've tried to kind of use that space in particular, which is our education garden, this year, ever since I started here last summer, as a space to kind of model how we could engage community differently. And having those goats, man, I'll never do anything that the community likes more than having those goats. Every day, somebody's like, "When are the goats coming back?" Goats aren't coming back anytime soon. And it's been really cool to like grow, tomatoes and squash and beans and corn, and have people come through for events and get to hand pollinate them, and like grow potatoes and have people be like, "So wait, what part of a potato we eat?" Like, it's amazing to me just how not fluent we are about the relationship between plants and where our food comes from. Like, so many of us just don't have any literacy around agriculture. 2 decades ago, 2 generations ago, that would have been implicit for basically everybody who wasn't, the descendant of a duke. You know what I mean? And so, like, that's the stuff that's really exciting to me, and it's been nice to be able to do that and to have the autonomy to do that. I mean, I think that I'm really, that is what's awesome about working for a nonprofit, is that they let me do crazy things like that, which is cool.
Well, and it brings to mind, like, when you mentioned the next version of this park, or the sort of replacement for it that's been designed, that maybe and not to get too into the politics of it, or to ask you to comment outside of what's sensible in your current role, since you're on the clock, but like I wonder how much of that comes down to just a lack of recognition on the part of city agencies of this dimension of what a park represents, that food could come from parks, and that food is part of an ecosystem. It's that they tend to get kind of separated in our minds, like park space, just natural space, and city space, like the idea that we leave the city to go to nature or to go to the wilderness, and that not that like we've imposed a city in the midst of nature and wilderness. That way of thinking seems like it's fundamental to the sort of shift that you and I want to see, I would presume to say, and that I would also presume to say we should all want to see. But have you found that there's been any like progress with like making the case or getting people to sort of see what you're saying?
No. But what I can say is that what I am really excited about is that Concrete Plant Park, the foodway at Concrete Plant Park, Nathan Hunter, who manages that space, and a group of people from YMPJ, so Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice up in the Bronx, and now a growing cohort of people who work in urban agriculture and urban green spaces are coming together to organize around this idea around the idea of community activated green spaces. And we have been meeting. I haven't been able to meet as much as I would like during the summer months, but we have been meeting regularly for almost a year now, to try and actually use the foodway as a case study for why public policy needs to put forward more edible and medicinal spaces on public land. So there is a movement behind that, and I'm really honored to be in that conversation, and it's such an amazing group of people. So that gives me a lot of hope right now. And as you know, as my park gets taken off the ventilator, so to speak, I am excited to be able to pour my energy into that and into telling that story and helping to gain traction with that. But yeah, I mean, the bureaucracy and all of the moving parts, and the fact that for them it is a bottom line. It's very, it feels, and I'm feeling I will admit and own that I'm feeling a little pessimistic today, given that the latest climate change report has come out, and it's like the last time one came out, like 2016 or whatever, it was like we've got 12 years, and now they're just like, actually, this clip, we're done. And like the fact that we've had this time and our governments have squandered it. I'm filled with a lot of anger today, actually. And you see that happen on every scale of the fractal of governance, right? And it makes it really hard to know what you're supposed to do when you get up in the morning. I don't know about you, but like that's what I'm struggling with now. It's like, do I go full bindweed, which is actually sequestering some modicum of carbon, or do I just like actually not go to my job and go downtown and like scream at politicians all day? Like, what do I do with my time?
Yeah, that is a relatable question, and I appreciate you sharing that, honestly, because it's part of this conversation to me that doesn't get enough of an underline, which is just how enraging, and rightfully enraging, this status quo is, this like unsustainable status quo.
Yeah. And it's like, I have chosen not to have children, but I have godchildren, and I have very good friends who are all having kids. And it's like, what kind of world are they going to live in? What kind of world are you and I going to be able to, like, when I'm 80, I can't fight people over a bottle of Avion. I'm not interested in that. That's not a good look. What are we supposed to do? And it's very enraging.
Yeah. And it seems like it's founded on, or the root of it, maybe I shouldn't, sully the word root with this notion, but it really does come down to, I think, this lack of literacy that you mentioned before. It seems to me, I mean, there's more to it than that. Plant literacy and like capitalist greed are not necessarily, like one doesn't fix the other, but I have to imagine that if people just understood at a basic level, in a way that I've been totally illiterate to, and over the last few years, honestly through luck, in large part, to have like met people that led me into greater awareness, who had experience that put me into contact with soil and food, and to have these concepts like brought into my field of view in the first place, is a sign of my privilege, I suppose, as someone who has the kind of work I do that allows me to be flexible with my time and to spend time going to farms and living upstate the way I do, work remotely, all this stuff. A lot of people just don't have any bandwidth to start understanding how plants work and what the difference between like roots and rhizomes are and all this stuff. So I have to believe that if everyone up the chain, from folks doing work on a farm to someone writing legislation, understood the basic like behaviors of things in ecosystems and the reliance we have on one another in the non-human and human sense, like that would change the way that policy is enacted. But I think there's probably more to it than just plant blindness. I think there are other factors, but that feels like a really key one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe a step back from, and I've been struggling with the term plant blindness just because it's potentially viewed as ableist, but,
Mm.
plant ignorance, I guess I could say. But like stepping back from that is just like this idea that the natural world is inanimate. I mean, I think that's where kind of the colonization mindset really uh, poisons how we relate to all of life around us. Is this idea that we're people and everything else is just a thing for us to extract and enact upon, and like, oh, it's just dirt, just dig it up, whatever. Like, if you could see the difference. I hopped over the fence into the construction area because part of my park has already been bulldozed and we've been doing some soil sample tests. I hopped over the fence last week to collect some soil that is now just like gray dirt, from the park that's already been bulldozed, to test it in comparison to the part right next to the next to the oats, that are growing on this side of the fence. And I mean, just, it's like looking at a corpse as compared to looking at a living system. You know what I mean? And I think the other thing I've been thinking about a lot is, I function and work for a nonprofit, and I have a lot of feelings about the nonprofit industrial complex. And I think it's very interesting to me that we always, and that the narrative is always that we need to teach, the underserved and the marginalized and BIPOC communities and poor communities. Those communities actually know a lot about plants. They have their own methodologies for healing. They know how to grow food. These are the communities that have been growing community gardens for 50 years in New York City. I actually want to do work where all the legislators have to come volunteer here. I want them to have to learn how to compost. I want them to have to see what they're killing, because they're the ones who go back to their very nice big houses and turn on their flat screen TVs and watch a nature show and think that nature is somewhere else. I'm not worried about the like Puerto Rican teenagers who maybe don't know what plants are. They're not the ones making decisions right now. And so I think there's something really interesting about even the way that we go about thinking that we're going to change the world. Now, yes, I do think that those of us who are not in power have to build a system that renders the old one obsolete. But like, until the people who keep holding on to power have some understanding of the implications of the choices they made, I don't know. It just feels something about what we're doing is not working, and I'm trying to figure out how we make it work better. I've actually been asked to like collaborate with the ESCR folks on like a community event, and I actually more and more I'm like, I want all of the construction people to have to come volunteer in the park. That's the event I want to host, not an event for the community. I want them to have to come lead with me for an afternoon. I want the people who decided that me and my staff didn't need a bathroom or access to running water all summer to have to come help me clean up some human dookie and see how they feel about eating lunch after that.
Yeah.
I'm starting to talk too much. Part of my job. Sorry, we gotta change the subject.
Yeah, no. You brought me to a good pivot point anyway, which is to talk about New York as a site of agricultural engagement with the public or with contractors, as the case may be. But it seems to me New York is, well, I want to say this in kind of two parts, I guess, because like on the one hand, I think New York is very unique as a space of managing land and putting it to agricultural use for urban farming, community gardens. Like it's a special place in that regard. At the same time, the more I travel, the more I find that every city has a rich, extant community of people doing this work. And a lot of times, like you're saying, it's tied to immigrant communities, to poorer communities that, for obvious reasons, have carried forward traditions of food sovereignty into the places they live. And in that widespread, diverse network, I see like a huge part of the answer if we could only engage it and uplift it. And obviously that can't be done in a centralized way. So whoever your counterparts are in those, if there are any in those areas, seem to me to like to represent some hope. And I want to seize on that, especially given the trajectory we've been on in this conversation. But I wonder if you can just kind of give me a sense of like, yeah, what do you think it is that makes New York sort of special in this sense of having like land available in the first place for this sort of thing, and the communities that are engaging in the way that like we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you said, most urban centers, particularly these days, have such a diverse community of people, um, who for whom this sort of relationship to land is not as disassociated as it is for uh, people who have been middle class and up for a couple of generations. This past spring, I hosted a Zoom workshop with folks from across the globe who garden here in New York to talk about the plants and the people that have found a way to survive in New York's and to think about New York's changing climate, right? So it was really awesome to have Uzma Chowdhury and her uncle, who both garden here in New York City, talking about the bitter melons that they grow and like all of the different Bangladeshi plants that they have brought here. And her uncle, Mr. Rashid, actually has land in Florida where he grows his mangoes and his papayas and stuff like that. Or to talk to Yemi Amu, who runs Oko Farms, and to like learn about her journey of like being a Nigerian teenager who came here and didn't really want anything to do with her identity as a Nigerian person. And then through time getting into food, and then going into growing food, and then realizing like, wait a minute, why am I not growing the water spinach? Why am I not growing these plants that like are what I reach for when I'm wanting something that feels like home? And so I think you see that across, if you look at Detroit, right? You've got all of the Black community that left the Jim Crow South and moved to places like Detroit, and then brought that knowledge with them, right? You see that in Philly, you see that in LA, like this is, it's there. I come from Appalachia, and my family has always had gardens. My family has always hunted. My family has always fished. And I too, we did that until I was probably in my teens. And then we moved to a, place where we didn't have a yard. And it was only like, as I was kind of grappling with the climate crisis about a decade ago, that I was like, man, where are the blackberries at? I got to do something that'll make me not feel like I'm like failing at life. You know what I mean? And started to learn about the plants that grow around me, and started to learn about how diverse New York City's ecological landscape was because of all the people who had come here, and because of even just the soil coming in the ballast of slave ships, dropping seed banks into the land. You know what I mean? Like the amount of layers of history of that is in a space, particularly like New York, is very, very complex, rich, heavy, all of that.
Yeah. And this continues the pivot that I was kind of hoping to set up, which was to start talking about the C.U.R.B and how you're highlighting those lineages and legacies. And I'm reminded of the shore crabs that are rife along the coastline there and around Queens, I guess it is, as the result of trading ships carrying them in their ballast. And now they're just endemic to the area.
They live here now.
Right. And if we accept a productive, reciprocal maybe relationship with them and any other living thing that we share this space with, then part of that involves eating them, right? And like engaging them not as pests, but as just part of our surroundings. And that's part. I mean, I would love to hear kind of your synopsis of what the C.U.R.B is doing at this point, because I get the sense it's evolved and it's grown a lot, obviously. But part of it seems to be like just teaching people not to fear eating what's around them as part of recognizing and just embracing the biodiversity that urban spaces represent.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that word abundance. So I'll use the example of ramps, right? So I'm from Appalachia, right? Where ramps were like a thing. That was just like what you ate because it was abundant. They were called hillbilly onions. Nobody wanted them until they were rare. Now all of a sudden people come raiding forests for them, right? Because they're rare. Same with lobsters, right? Lobsters used to be the food of enslaved people until they were rare. And I think that it's very interesting how humans assign value based on a scarcity model. And I want, above all, in whatever I'm doing, to be looking for the abundance, to be counteracting that scarcity model as much as humanly possible. And so Asian short crabs, abundant. They are they are eating native ecologies out of house and home. Do I call them invasive? No. They're here. How do we work with that? How do we create space for indigenous communities, human and non, while also acknowledging the fact that this is just what this system is, right? Indigenous communities, since Europeans started bringing plants over, have been like, oh, white man's footprint. Oh, it's really good for cuts. That's a plantain. Like they've not been like, oh, get it out of here. It's not supposed to be here. They've been like, oh, okay, well, that's what that is. All right, let's see. What can we do with that? You know? And I think like that idea of kind of shifting and moving with a shifting and moving system is at the core of what I've done with C.U.R.B. Now, I think the thing that most people like about C.U.R.B. and that meets most people where they are is the idea of doing these toxicity tests and helping people who want to forage think about those relationships between intoxicated land, particularly in urban centers. And then testing things from the grocery store and being like, yeah, this lamb's quarter from a tree pit in Bushwick had some lead in it. So did the conventionally grown spinach I just tested at the grocery store. It's more complicated than you think, you know? It's not about giving people hard answers. I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist and a storyteller. It's about deconstructing our notions of like purity and challenging the ways we assign value.
Hmm. Yeah, and that idea of purity kind of rang the nativism bell in my mind again too when it comes to these conversations about invasives or what constitute good plants, you know, and good neighbors, non-human is in this case. And I'd love to dig into this abundance scarcity dichotomy because this comes up a lot for me, and I find that there's a lot of depth to the notion of an abundance mindset. And I guess I'm just curious for like what that term means to you.
It's kind of a poetic answer. The word abundance for me is implicitly hopeful. Well, okay, so I can answer this with a story. I was just relating this to Nathan Hunter this weekend. We had a fruiting persimmon pear of native persimmon trees here in the park. Delicious, love them. The one that fruits, so the one that most people would identify as the female tree, was in the part of the park that's already been demolished. They had a lovely flush of persimmons last fall, but much like persimmons, you know, Asian persimmons, if you don't pick them at the right time, they're no good, right? They're super astringent, not good. And they don't like get better the longer you leave them off the tree. You got to get them when they're right. I was so excited. They were all fruiting. We have this whole tree covered in them. I was like, oh, we're going to have such a great harvest. One afternoon, a gentleman comes up to me, his arms filled, his hands filled with all these persimmons that he just picked off the tree, everything he could reach. And he was like, what are these? And I was like, those are native persimmons. He had picked them too soon. He saw abundance, and his scarcity brain told him, even though he didn't know what it was, I must have all of that. Even though he didn't even know what it was or when he was supposed to harvest it, he was just like, that's for me because it's here right now. And in doing so, he made it so that no one else could enjoy a single persimmon. There's a relationship there. There's a poetic relationship there between scarcity and abundance. I'm not going to put words on it. I'm just going to tell that story.
Yeah, it's not just a mindset, I guess. It's sort of is the point of it. If it's a mindset, it's one of like recognizing reality, which is that the earth provides everything we need. And that's the reason we're still here. If it weren't the case, then we wouldn't be talking about this. And we've come to kind of replace earth as our provider with, you know, these unsustainable extractive systems that, yeah, are all predicated on the idea that if I don't get this now, someone else will. And that's just not sustainable. I think we're seeing the consequences of that difference in mentality, and to me it's fascinating that it can come down to an outlook, that you can extrapolate that example you just gave to our entire economy, to our global social order in a lot of ways. And I think that sort of thing, we alluded to this earlier, it can be subverted by just having experience, at least in the individual, by having experiences that reveal to you the abundance and what that represents, and that you'll never, if you know what to look for and how to look for it, and how to, over time, how to build reciprocal relationships with the environments that provide what you need, you'll never be without what you need. In a city, that's a different conversation than it is in the woods, it seems to me, but it's no less true of a city, and it shouldn't be, right? And I guess another note of hope to me is that there's so much opportunity in cities, and maybe uniquely so, because of the density of people and the diversity culturally that's represented, and the shifts that could be made to make more productive use, abundant use of green spaces. But I guess it does just, like, all of that's nice to talk about, but if there's no one in the decision-making, role who can make the shift or help contribute to the shift, then it is just a conversation, right? But that's sort of the thing with the C.U.R.B, is that it's you're hosting a conversation, but you're doing it by way of, like, actually engaging people in cooking and eating and gathering and processing. So, like, the conversation is just part of an act, right? Like, you're enacting the thing. Again, it's a theme that's come up. Is the C.U.R.B still operating? Are you still holding banquets and doing that stuff?
In the sense that I'm doing them here. What's been really nice is that I kind of, when I was offered the job to work here full time, I was like, I've never had a full-time job. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. I was supposed to do a bunch of cool art projects last year, but that weren't happening. And I was like, well, wow, okay, this is a 2-acre space in Lower Manhattan. You know what I mean? Like, what a gift, to be able to be paid to activate this space. I'm probably not the best gardener, but I'm a pretty okay storyteller and community builder. And so that's what I am doing here. And so, the C.U.R.B work is kind of now folded into my work at Stycov. I'm not sure what will happen if I choose to not work here anymore. It's all continuously evolving. It's all iterative, right? Yeah, and I mean, I think something you said, I just wanted to, like, touch on that I think is part of the other problem, right? Is this notion of individualism. And most people, if you come to New York from somewhere else, you're coming because you're going to make it, right? You're going to become something. And it does kind of seep into how we function. So this idea that this guy was just like, ooh, that's something. It looks like it might be edible. I'll just take all of it. Didn't think that anyone else around him might need some. And so even more than thinking about abundance, it's remembering that we are interdependent, and remembering that you are not an island, right? That everyone else around you also should be able to have some. I think that's one of the things that when I think about the climate crisis, it's like we can all be enraged, we can all be whatever, but then sure enough, you and I sit down because we're going to make a podcast, as opposed to getting up from our desks and being like, no, stop it. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's one of the things that, like, I'm currently grappling with, is that all of us are implicated in the, like, well, but I got to pay my rent though. So I can't like go on strike, like I got a deadline. I got to pull this bindweed, how are we going to shake ourselves out of this? I don't know what to describe that as. This dream.
Finger trap comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the further in we go, the harder it is to extricate ourselves. And it is and the teeth of it to me are this, they take the form of this individual collective tension where we are now under the auspices of a system or under the sway of a system that appeals to us as individuals, even though the consequences, as always, are collective. But we need to be mobilized on an individual basis to participate in this collective project of changing things, and the conditions are just such that it's seemingly impossible. And yeah, what can we do besides fruitlessly throw our bodies? I mean, I have nothing but admiration and respect for direct action, and I think it's increasingly becoming clear that that's going to be the form that change takes. But if given the choice between showing up in a 15-second clip on Democracy Now! Or having a conversation that maybe changes people's minds, hopefully, or illuminates an issue in a way that they hadn't considered before, I feel like people are increasingly recognizing the obvious. I mean, have you noticed that in your work, that people are like, has there been an arc even in the relatively short time you've been doing this stuff, that people seem more engaged and aware?
I think it's going to take all the things. It's going to take all the things for us to turn this ship around at this point. And I think we all have to everyone has a different skill set, right? And I just want to say, like, the Sunrise Movement, it's amazing to me the way young people are mobilizing and activating each other. And like, it's such a older person thing to say, like, I have so much hope in them. Like, I do, but also, like, the people who are in power right now need to act. And I'm not going to just be like, cool, I'm going to go back to sleep while all the Gen Zers figure it out. That was a tangent. What were we talking about?
Well, it's exactly that, the shifting public attitudes towards these things. And
Oh yeah. So have I seen, I think at the end of the day, there are the people who are on board, right? Who understand these things. The thing that I struggle with is, how do I get to, say, the construction guy I'll get two examples. There's a guy who works for the construction who always wants to help me. He's very helpful, but his version of helping is like taking his car and driving over some plants in order to help me move something. So like, he was literally like, oh, I'll help you move these plants. And he threw them in the back of his truck and then drove over a beach plum, because it's just not a thing. It's not a thing he sees. It's not a thing. As opposed to the construction guy who literally walked into my garden one day and he was in his full vest and hard hat. And I was like, oh God, they're here to tell me that they're going to cut it down sooner. And he was like, this is a beautiful garden. And he comes and checks on it regularly, right? That guy, I don't need to get to him. He gets it, right? I need to get to the guy who drove over the beach plum. But that guy has a whole different set of values. It's a much further reach. I think that's the part that I keep coming up against, is everybody who's been vaccinated understands how vaccines work. It's the individuals who choose that they're gonna do something else that ruins the party for everybody else. So how do we kind of counteract that individualism, that individualistic kind of drive, and that plant ignorance, that non-humanist ignorance, I guess I would say. That's the part that I keep banging my head against a wall about.
Yeah, I can't add anything to that except to say that it is an important and very much open question, and I hope that we all consider the ways that we might answer it in our own lives. Oh yeah, please.
I do have one hopeful way to end that, and that is that one of the things I have found in both working here and in my work with the C.U.R.B is, and I think I used this phrase before, but I think one of the things that really works with the C.U.R.B is this idea that when you're having a complex conversation, you can find whatever the entry point is that meets someone where they are. Oh, you like food? Cool. Oh, you like Indian food? Cool. Lamb's quarter is a Indian and Bangladeshi treat. Okay, cool. I got you there. All right, great. Let's talk about the spice trade. Okay, great. Let's talk about, let's talk about global shipping, right? So you try and kind of find whatever I was raised by Southern Baptist, so I'm real good at the figuring out what the treat is, and then kind of luring you into my proselytization. so I think that is what we can do, right? And so maybe that's the challenge for all of us on an individual level, is to go and talk to the people in your lives. Same with racism, right? Go and talk to the people in your lives for whom these things are not real, for whom this stuff is abstract, who are going to be dead before the doo-doo hits the fan. Because we have to figure out, like, what is the point? What is the point that, like, gets someone, oh, the COVID is starting to show up in children. You have children. Now do you care? Like, how do we find the sweet treat that gets people to pay attention? And for each person, there is one. It's just very hard to find it. And it's a very granular activity to do that on an individual level. But that is something all of us can be doing in the same way that having this conversation, in the same way that the work you do and the work that I do and the work that all of us can do can help move that emergent conversation forward. So I don't mean to be all gloom and doom. There's work to be done. We all need to do it every day. And I have so much respect for the work you do.
Oh, thank you. And likewise. And yeah, I feel like that's the perfect kind of note for us to conclude on, because like I said at the beginning, the goal here isn't to give false hope or to put an optimistic sheen on things, but I do feel like the amount of work that there is to be done just begs for so much engagement and so much creativity, and even if it's a grim backdrop, that's exciting, potential and exciting work. And I really appreciate what you're doing to move that conversation forward. And I appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to talk to me about all this. What do you have planned for the rest of the day?
I'm gonna go pull some horse nettle. We're getting ready to give away all of the plants in the north end of the park at the end of this month, because I'm not gonna let them go to a landfill. So I'm gonna try and stop some of them from going to a landfill. So we are getting the north end of the park ready for community groups to come through on the last 2 weekends of the month and rehome, adopt as many plants as possible. So that's what I'll be doing this afternoon.
Oh, sounds like God's work. When is the park actually due for closure?
It happens in 2 parts. So the north end of the park closes, I believe, Labor Day weekend. That was the piece of information I was given months ago that I'm still operating off of. And then we have the bottom half of the park for another year ish. So yeah, so there will always be a green space or a public space open for the community. It will just look very different from time to time.
Right. Well, it's good to know that people can still visit it for the next year or so at least, and it's something like its current state.
Yeah, we will still have a mulberry tree, ground cherries, one of the hugels I built that's laden with strawberries and blueberries and Juneberries and chokeberries. That's still here. The big elder bush that I rescued last summer is thriving. There's plenty to see and taste and feel here for a little while longer.
Yeah, that feels like it could apply to more than just that park, but we'll leave it at that. And yeah, thank you again for your time and your insight as always.
Good to see you, Doug. I'll see you soon.